Yes.
So I've showed the witness with the marked as 980, and are you familiar with some of those records?
Yes.
Okay. And those are some of the multi-care records from Mr. Ellis, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And what's the base labeling that's included on the bottom of those?
It says Rankine Medical Expert 004120.
Okay. And you received thousands of pages of medical records, correct?
I did.
Okay. But only after you had written your report?
That's correct.
Oh. Okay.
Please, thank you. I appreciate it.
So we're talking about methamphetamine and its potential effects on an individual, but I want to move on to cardiomyopathy. Cardiomyopathy, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm a medical expert, but it is a fancy way of saying a dilated heart, right?
So, cardiomyopathy is a fancy way of saying a disease of the heart, and it can have many reasons. So a dilated cardiomyopathy has particular reasons why a heart will get dilated. And so the cardiomyopathy portion is just to tell you that there's a disease to the heart.
Okay. And Mr. Ellis had a dilated cardiomyopathy, right?
He had a dilated enlarged heart. I didn't see where he was fully worked up for the myopathy, for the disease portion of it, but I agree that he had a dilated enlarged heart, and likely due to his substance use and abuse.
It was also noted that he had hypertrophy of his left ventricle, right?
That is correct.
And what's the effects of left ventricular hypertrophy?
So functionally, that happens when you have high blood pressure. The left ventricle of the heart pushes blood out to the body. When the blood goes out to the body, it meets some resistance. If it meets resistance more than usual, like every other muscle in our body, it's going to get bigger to be able to push past that resistance. And someone who has chronic methamphetamine use, we talked about them having vasoconstriction. It's not unlikely to see someone to have left ventricular hypertrophy who's a chronic user of methamphetamine.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but what that does is it makes the heart have to work harder to function at the same level, right?
That's correct.
Right. So in a demanding situation like this altercation, the heart has to work harder in order to provide oxygen and blood flow to the rest of the body, right?
That is correct.
And that could also lead to hypoxia, right?
That's the result of the hypoxia.
Okay.
So it's the chicken or the egg. It's the heart is working harder to send blood to the tissues because the tissues are under stress and oxygen is not getting to the tissues. So it's a cyclical kind of process in the body.
Okay. But it gets us back to this state of hypoxia, which you've been focusing on.
Well, I don't know if I've necessarily been focusing on, I'm just answering the questions, but it does, his heart is absolutely going to have to work harder because he has a dilated enlarged heart.
And if it can't keep up with that demand, there can be issues.
That is correct.
All right. And the enlarged and dilated heart with left ventricular hypertrophy, that puts him at a greater risk for sudden cardiac death, right?
Yes.
Okay. So, and you talked about the methamphetamine levels of 2,400 nanograms per milliliter, right?
Yes.
And you talked about the fact that 2,400 nanograms per milliliter is also a potentially lethal amount of methamphetamine, right?
Yes.
Okay. So that also puts him at greater risk for a sudden cardiac event as well.
Yes.
And those two issues combined, the meth levels as well as the cardiomyopathy, and the mechanism of what that can do and how it can transpire within the body can eventually lead you into a hypoxic state as well, right?
What, in Manny Ellis's case, we're missing the altercation. So that's really where the hypoxia is impacting the heart and the methamphetamine's involvement on the heart. So if we're talking about Mr. Ellis's case, then it's a combination of all of it.
Okay. Well, one of the things that you focused on within your report is actually the report of not only Dr. Clark, but also the report of the cardiologist, Daniel, and do you know how to pronounce his last name?
I'll let you do it.
I don't want to do it. It's too difficult. Why don't I spell it for the record? WOHLGELERNTER. Wolganertner. No, if that's right. Can we call him Dr. Dan? Sure. Let's just talk to him about it as if he's the cardiologist. So you relied on the cardiologist that was hired by the state, his report, right?
I did.
Okay. And in that report, he talks about pulseless electrical activity, right?
Yes.
And he says that, well, let's pull up State's Exhibit 537. Your Honor, is it okay if I just leave it in this binder so that I don't? If I can approach the witness, Your Honor. So I'm handing you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 537.
Okay.
That there?
Yes.
And that's the cardiologist's report, not?
Yes.
And that's what you relied upon in helping formulate your opinion in this case, right?
Yes.
And I want to draw your attention to a particular paragraph on page 2 of this cardiologist report where he talks about the presence of PEA, pulseless electrical activity.
Yes.
And it's about 4 paragraphs down. And in there he indicates, upon arrival of emergency medical personnel at the scene of Ellis's encounter with law enforcement, Ellis was face down, still handcuffed and hobbled with a spit hood over his head. He was unresponsive with a Glasgow coma scale of 3 with agonal respirations, subsequently clarified in an interview as occasional ineffective shallow respirations, and bradycardic, subsequently clarified in an interview as weak and slow pulse, but without numerical heart rate. An initial electrocardiogram, ECG, showed normal sinus rhythm. The combination of normal sinus rhythm on the ECG and a lack of corresponding pulses on the physical examination is most consistent with pulseless electrical activity. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
So what he's stating there, to break it down, is that when EMS, the emergency medical staff, appear on scene, and they come in contact with Mr. Ellis, that they don't feel, he's saying, they don't feel any mechanical pulse, right?
Yes.
But that they're seeing a normal sinus rhythm on their EKG monitor, right?
That's right.
And he's saying that's how I know that there's pulseless electrical activity, because the paramedics are going to tell this jury that Mr. Ellis, upon their arrival, did not have a pulse when we felt, no mechanical pulse, but electrical activity on the EKG machine, right?
Yes.
Okay, but no paramedic has testified yet in this case. You understand that?
I don't know who's testifying.
And you would agree with me, right, that when you are offering opinions in the case, you sometimes can only be as good as the facts upon which you are relying or which have been relayed to you, right?
Yep.
Overruled. You may answer.
I think you said
Yes.
right. So that's the information that this cardiologist had that he relied upon in order to formulate the opinion that Mr. Ellis was in PEA upon arrival of EMS. Right?
Okay.
All right. The next thing that you talk about in your report is positional asphyxia. And you cite to a Steinberg article from 2021. Remember that article?
Yes.
Okay, and I can take down so that it's be simpler there, doctor.
Appreciate it.
And that's an article from 2021, right?
Yes.
This incident happened in 2020?
Yes.
Okay. So obviously post-dates this incident. And in that article, do you remember that it discusses kind of the controversial nature of the idea of positional asphyxia?
Yes.
And you'd agree with me that this idea that positional asphyxia can lead to hypoxia is a disputed issue within the medical community.
There are some that believe that position cannot cause asphyxia.
Okay. And the article goes on to discuss actually some of the studies that have revealed that it is very rare and occurs approximately 2 or 3 times in the year, a positional asphyxia case, correct?
Yeah, there's some articles that are suggesting that it's more rare than actual occurrences.
Okay. There's also studies that show that positional asphyxia by itself does not have any significant effect or respiratory compromise that could lead to asphyxia and death as well, right?
I disagree with those articles, but those articles exist, yes.
All right, and those are peer-reviewed articles done by doctors just like yourself, right?
Yes.
Okay. And you're relying upon this idea of positional asphyxia to support the proposition that Mr. Ellis was hypoxic, right?
So it's I use the term mechanical asphyxia, which is nuanced, but it goes a little bit further than position. It's not just his position, but the fact that he has weight on his back, and the fact that he's hobbled. So the mechanical asphyxia is specific to the constellation of findings.
Okay, well, let's talk about the weight on his back. So you'd agree with me that you don't have any idea how long Mr. Ellis had weight on his back, right?
From what I understand, he had weight on his back from the time that he is hobbled to the time in which EMS arrive.
And how did you come to find that information?
I believe that there was reports that suggested that the law enforcement officer was on his back until right before the EMS arrived.
Okay. So it's your opinion now that there was an officer on Mr. Ellis's back from the time that he was hobbled until the time that EMS arrived?
Yes, that's what I understand.
But you also previously had an understanding that Mr. Ellis was put into the recovered position as well, right?
From what I understood, that he was briefly placed in a recovery position to check for materials within his pockets prior to then being placed back into the prone position. Yes.
Okay. And how long was he put in the recovered position for?
From what I understand, a brief period of time. I don't know exactly the amount of time.
Okay. Well, if you don't know the exact amount of time that he's in the recovered position, how do you know the exact amount of time that he's got waiting on his back?
I didn't say that I knew the exact amount of time. I answered your question as to what my understanding is the amount of time that someone was on his back.
Okay. And is that information that the Attorney General's office told you?
No, I believe I read it. I mean, I have to look through my notes and records to see exactly where it exists.
And you're aware as well that Mr. Ellis wasn't placed in the recovery position once, but he was actually placed in the recovery position twice, right?
I become aware of that he was in that position twice, yes.
Okay, and you don't know how long he was in the recovery position for a second time as well, right?
That's correct.
Okay. So during the incident, you're now aware that Mr. Ellis was placed in recovery position not only once, but twice, and you don't know how long an officer was placing any amount of weight on his back, right?
That's correct.
Okay. And in fact, do you remember during our interview on November 17th, 2022, when I asked you about how long Mr. Ellis had been put in the recovery position, you actually had no idea that he had ever been placed in the recovery position at that time?
I believe that.
Okay. So you would agree with me that at the time in November 2022, when we were discussing this case, no one had told you, not even from the Attorney General's office, that Mr. Ellis had been placed in the recovery position at all.
That could be correct. Either I wasn't told or I didn't remember, but
And in fact, you also said, I don't know how long he was there in terms of someone being on him with any amount of pressure on him as well, right?
yeah, yes, I just answered.
Okay. And you'd agree with me that it would be important to know how long an individual is actually putting pressure on someone in order to support your opinion about hypoxia, right?
Not necessarily, because again, the restraint, the altercation is going to lead to a hypoxia in someone's system. It would lead to hypoxia in any one of us. And then placed in a position for any length of time, in a hobble position, in a prone position, is going to impact his ability to breathe and impact his ability to blow off the acid that is building up in his body because of the hypoxia. So the exact time frame, if unknowable, would not change my opinion.
Okay. So absent any pressure on his back whatsoever, it wouldn't change your opinion that death is going to occur.
Absent any pressure on his back, right now, I understand that there was pressure on his back during the time frame in which he's hobbled, in which he's being restrained. In the video, I see that. There's obviously not video for the remainder of his altercation, the remainder of the fact of his prone position and restraint. And I wouldn't be able to say whether or not he would be alive or dead without any pressure on his back. The prone position in someone like Mr. Ellis in a hobbled prone position is a huge risk factor for his ability to exchange for oxygen. So it's very difficult for me to parse out whether or not if he had pressure on his back or not, and for what periods of time.
Okay, fair enough. So there's a couple other things that you noted in your direct examination, and that had to do with injuries that you felt are consistent with your opinion in this matter, right?
Yes,
Okay, so like the scraping on either side of Mr. Ellis's cheeks,
yes,
and that's something that you said you think is consistent with what you saw on video, right?
yes,
Okay, and as well, what you just told us about an officer having pressure on Mr. Ellis's back, that's something that you've seen on video, right?
that's correct.
Okay. Are you aware that that our client, Officer Rankine, is not even on scene at any point when all of that's taking place?
I don't, does not matter to me who is present, who's not present. That to me has no bearing. The who is of no bearing to me.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you, it matters to us, so that's why I'm asking the question.
I do not know where any one of the defendants were as it relates to this case.
Okay. And you also talked about this chipped tooth that he had, right?
Yes,
But the chipped tooth is also something that he mentioned that he sustained in that 2019 meth-induced psychotic episode, right?
yes, I understand that now, yes.
And there are certain things that you noted that are not apparent in your review of the autopsy as well. Like, you never saw any petechial hemorrhages, right?
That's correct.
Okay, and petechial hemorrhages is something that you noted previously in positional asphyxia cases as being consistent with your findings, right?
You don't have to have petechial hemorrhages in positional asphyxia or mechanical asphyxia or even compression of the neck. You don't necessarily have to have petechial hemorrhages. They can be present. If they're present, that's significant. If they're not present, it doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Okay. Not present in this case.
That's correct.
All right. And you also noted that there are no fractures to the neck or ribs, right?
That's correct.
And that there was no fracture to the thyroid cartilage as well.
That's right.
And then you talked about some anatomical evidence, you talked with Mr. Ossier about anatomical evidence that may be evidence of hypoxia that would be found in the hippocampus, right?
Yes, we talked about that.
But you weren't able to check that, and so that's not present.
Yeah, we don't have the hippocampus to look at.
And you also talk about, in your report, Mr. Ellis indicating that he was having trouble breathing.
Yes,
Okay. And you would agree with me that having issues breathing would also be consistent with Mr. Ellis having a cardiac issue at that point as well, right?
I don't know. I don't know.
Well, let me ask you this. Are you aware that Mr. Ellis has a history of having breathing problems?
I believe he has a history of asthma.
Okay. Do you know when the last time any medical record indicated that Mr. Ellis was having trouble breathing?
I don't remember exactly when the last time they suggested he had problems breathing.
Okay. Some of the other things that you've noted in your report as well is this LVNR hold, right?
Yes,
And that, you're saying that that is consistent with your opinion in this matter?
yes.
And obviously that's not something Officer Rankine was even on scene for, is that right?
I don't know.
And you've also indicated that Mr. Ellis was hobbled as well, right?
Yes,
And did you review any records indicating that Officer Rankine requested any hobbles?
I didn't see anything that suggested that.
Okay. Have you ever seen any records indicate he's ever been trained on any hobbles?
No, I haven't seen any of that.
You also talk about the spit hood being placed over Mr. Ellis's head being a significant factor in your determination.
Yes,
Okay. And did you ever see any indication that Officer Rankine placed the spit hood on Mr. Ellis's head?
no, I did not.
Have you ever seen any indication that he was ever trained on one or ever requested one?
No, not to my knowledge.
Okay. And in fact, one of the things that you cite in your report is a study on spit hoods, right?
Yes,
And in there, you indicate that, let me pull it up, that there is a recent study evaluating the effects of spit hoods to suggest no ventilatory or circulatory compromise to 15 study participants who were placed in the hood. And this study was done on healthy adults at rest, and this is the Marigold 2020 study, right?
Yes, I go on and qualify that statement, but yes, I said that.
Sure. So, but this study suggests that the spit hood wouldn't have any ventilatory or circulatory compromise on an individual, right?
I go on to say, as we know, Mr. Ellis was not at rest when the spit hood was used. So he was in an altercation and was hobbled. So the study, although there is a study, a single study, and that talks about spit hoods not being a problem or can cause issues, it doesn't apply to Mr. Ellis's case, is the point that I made in the paragraph.
Okay. And that study that you cited, that's a study that took place even after this incident in March of 2020, right?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. So that's a study that wouldn't have even been available at the time?
I'm going to check my report to see exactly when it was,
Sure, please.
when it was, I have it as 2020 in my citation. I don't give a date of when it came out, so I can't speak to its timeliness in relationship to Manny Ellis's death.
Okay. Sorry, one other thing I wanted to ask you about Mr. Ellis complaining about breathing.
Yes,
You'd agree with me that those complaints from Mr. Ellis may have been happening prior to my client ever arriving on scene, right?
I don't know.
Okay. So one of the last things I wanted to talk to you about is your work as a medical examiner and forensic pathologist. So in your work, is it fair to say that you don't treat patients that are still alive?
That is correct.
Okay. So you work, you don't work in the emergency room when those individuals are coming, right?
I do not work in the emergency room.
And so you're not there when people that have enlarged hearts and lethal amounts of methamphetamine go into cardiac arrest, right?
No, I'm not the treating physician for their fatal result.
Your practice consists of conducting an autopsy of people that have already passed away, right?
Yes,
And trying to make a determination as to why they passed away, right?
that is correct.
And in that body of work that you do, you see people with cardiomyopathies all the time, right?
A lot of the time.
Because isn't it true that cardiac disease is, I think, the #1 killer in America, is that right?
It is the leading cause of death in this country.
And you also see people die from methamphetamine as well, all the time, right?
I've seen my fair share of methamphetamine overdoses.
And you'd agree with me that there is a meth and drug addiction epidemic in this country, right?
Yes, I would agree with that.
Okay. You also see people, and this may fall into the category of cardiac disease, but you also see people with a history of chronic hypertension as well, right?
Yes,
So, and you see those people that are deceased because of those issues, right?
yes,
Methamphetamine,
yes,
cardiomyopathies,
yes.
and chronic hypertension.
I've seen it.
And Mr. Ellis had all 3 of those things.
He did have all 3 of those things.
I don't have any further.
Okay, Ms. Eeks, redirect.
Well, we're gonna have, put back up on the screen exhibit 255. This is a photograph that was shown to you by defense counsel, showing some injuries to Mr. Ellis's hand. injury on the first knuckle that was asked about, would you expect that injury to bleed?
Yes.
Okay, so if Mr. Ellis's hand was injured punching something, would you expect there to be blood on that surface?
If he's punching it more than once, the first blow might not leave blood on the object, but if the object is being punched multiple times, that's when blood would deposit on an object.
We can take a look at 256. And looking at 256, other than the injury to the first knuckle, are there any other injuries to the second, third, or fourth knuckles in Mr. Ellis's hand?
Not that I can see.
You still have up there, PowerPoint exhibit.
Yes, I do.
You were asked questions about this PowerPoint by defense counsel. Do you recall that?
Exhibit 2650, yes.
And first of all, do you have any idea when or why this PowerPoint was put together by Dr. Clark?
I don't.
Could you take a look at the page? That ends in 491.
I have it.
And you were asked some questions about the section that talks about subjective findings or opinion. Do you recall that?
I did.
Do you recall defense counsel reading you the first bullet underneath that subjective findings or opinion?
Yes.
What does the second bullet say?
Likely that most would agree that restraint is a significant factor.
Is that something that Dr. Clark put in his PowerPoint?
Yes, as it's written.
Now, you were asked about medical records for Mr. Ellis. First of all, can you tell the jury what's pericarditis?
Pericarditis is your pericardium, or peri is around, cardium is the heart. So it's a tissue around the heart. Usually has nice fluid inside of it. Your heart pumps in the sac, the pericardial sac, and it pumps nicely when there's good fluid in there. Pericarditis is an inflammation of that sac. And what happens is it's harder for the heart to pump inside the sac. And there's many different causes, autoimmune, viral. There's many different causes of why somebody could have pericarditis.
And you did look at the medical records related to Mr. Ellis.
Yes.
Correct? Did those reflect that Mr. Ellis had kind of recurring, a number of years ago, pericarditis episodes?
Objectively,
I'll print this overall.
Yes.
And can you tell the jury, is there anything in the medical records that changed your opinion with respect to the cause and manner of Mr. Ellis's death?
No.
And why not?
Because the altercation is and the mechanical asphyxia is what we call the efficient intervening cause. So that his medical record, his substance use and abuse, all of that was occurring. His dilated heart, all of that was known, and he was walking down the street. It's that altercation and interaction that was the new thing that led to his death. So at that moment in that time, I was aware of the history. I dug deeper into the history. There was nothing in the history that would make me change my opinion.
And did you already know some of that history when you gave your initial first impressions? Did you have some of those documents?
Yes.
Now, you were asked a series of factual questions about who did what and whether somebody was at a certain location. And I think you said a moment ago those things didn't matter to you. Can you just explain to the jury why that doesn't matter for purposes of you determining what the cause and manner of death are?
Yeah. Yeah, you know, the who is not as big of a deal when it comes to a homicide. If it's an other person other than that person who died that influenced their death, then it's going to be a homicide. And how many people did it, and those, and what their names are, and whether or not they're responsible, doesn't necessarily come into the medicine of forensics. That's more the legal side of these proceedings.
You talked a few minutes ago about petechial hemorrhages and said that you don't necessarily have to see those or would see those necessarily with this type of restraint that was involved with Mr. Ellis, is that right?
Yeah, you wouldn't have to see them. You know, we often see asphyxial cases without petechiae, or broken blood vessels, to be descriptive, and that doesn't mean that the asphyxia didn't happen.
What about with respect to the hyoid bone, and whether or not that's fractured? Is that something that you have to see, in order to establish that somebody has been choked, for example, or had their breathing occluded?
No, you don't have to see a fractured hyoid bone. Oftentimes, because the hyoid bone is tucked underneath the jawline, you may not even get impact to the hyoid bone. So you don't have to see a fracture of the hyoid bone.
Switching topics a little bit, have you ever reviewed an in-custody death where you didn't find law enforcement's actions were the proximate cause of the death?
I'll permit this overruled.
Have I ever been involved in a case that law enforcement is not the reason for the death?
Correct, where you've concluded, or it's been an in-custody death, and you've concluded that law enforcement actions were not the proximate cause of somebody's death.
Yes, many times.
Now, you talked a little bit about the spit hood and the manufacturer of warnings, and I think you talked about the one warning was with respect to not using it on somebody who's bleeding. Were there any other warnings that you noted in your report that were relevant?
I'm gonna object to that.
Well, it's,
There's no foundation.
well, it's vague. Anything else? That's basically the question?
I can rephrase it.
Please.
In your report, did you note any other restrictions or any other warnings with respect to the spit hood manufacturer's warnings with regard to its use?
I'm objecting in relevance, lack of foundation.
Well, did anything that you see affect your opinion about the manufacturer's warnings, if anything?
Yes.
Then you may answer.
The product specification clearly states, do not use on anyone that is vomiting, having difficulty breathing, or is bleeding profusely from the area around the mouth and nose. The warning includes improper use may result in serious injury or death due to asphyxiation, suffocation, or drowning in one's own fluid. The area that is specific to, that called out to me, was the difficulty breathing, not to use on someone who's difficulty breathing.
And you were asked some questions about your report and the timeline in your report. Do you still have that report up there?
Yes.
479. All right. Can you just tell us, does your timeline reflect whether or not Mr. Ellis ever advised that he couldn't breathe?
Yes.
Okay. And can you tell us, you talked about when Mr. Collins requested hobbles at 23:24:32. Is that before or after Mr. Ellis, according to your timeline, indicated the first time that he couldn't breathe?
It's after.
And when does Mr. Ellis, what's your timeline reflect about when Mr. Ellis said he couldn't breathe in relation to the Mr. Collins's request for hobbles?
Your Honor, I'm gonna object. This is currently subject to motion.
I'm sorry, what was that last part?
This is currently subject to our motion regarding Mr. Halmore.
Your Honor, the defense went into the timeline, and these are parts of the timeline that are relevant.
I understand the objection. I'm going to sustain the objection.
Did your timeline include other times and facts other than what the select ones that the defense asked you about?
I'm gonna object to your decision.
I'll permit this, overruled. Overruled.
Yes.
And did you include any indications of the times in which you noted that Mr. Ellis indicated he couldn't breathe?
Yes.
reports of the paramedics at the time that they first responded, and the description of Mr. Ellis. I'm gonna have you take a look at State's Exhibit 24. Any new, it's been marked as State's Exhibit 24. Do you recognize that document?
Can I see it too, Council? I can pull it up there.
Certainly. May I take it back?
Oh,
Oh, I have it here on the screen now.
All right, I'll give it back. Thanks.
no problem.
Do you recognize that document, Dr. Mitchell?
Yes.
And what is it?
It says a pre-hospital care report, Tacoma Fire Department of Manuel Ellis.
And is that one of the documents that you looked at and relied on in reaching your opinions of the case?
Yes.
And what does that document indicate in terms of the breathing situation, Mr. Ellis's breathing at the time the fire arrived?
It says that this 33-year-old male is unconscious, unresponsible, with minimal respiratory drive and deteriorating. And it goes on, talks about the, as it relates to the breathing, that the patient is now apneic with bradycardia despite the aggressive airway management, and developed into cardiac arrest,
And what's apnea?
not breathing.
And what's bradycardia?
A slowing of the heart, the heartbeat.
And those were the observations of fire, is that right?
Yes.
Now, you were asked some questions about other reports of officers saying that Mr. Ellis was still breathing or that his chest was still moving. If you assume for purposes of this question that's true, is that inconsistent with your findings, your conclusion, Mr., with respect to Mr. Ellis's cause and manner of death?
Object on tap.
Please make a short question.
Sure, no problem. Do you recall being asked questions about other officers making observations of Mr. Ellis breathing
Yes.
and seeing his chest move?
Yes.
Does that change your opinion, or does that affect your opinion that Mr. Ellis died from the same, your opinion with respect to the cause and manner of Mr. Ellis' death?
No.
Why not?
Because the mechanical asphyxia, the position that Mr. Ellis is in, is he's progressively getting worse. So he's progressively moving from breathing and being able to sustain his bodily function with the breathing that he has, to being seen by fire and EMS and not being able to do it, and actually having a witness cardiac arrest in front of EMS. So it's all consistent of what we've been talking about over the last several days.
If Mr. Ellis, with his enlarged heart and his methamphetamine at 2,400 nanograms or 2.4 milligrams per liter, had never encountered law enforcement, do you have an opinion as to whether or not he would have died that night?
Sustained.
You were asked some questions about whether or not Mr. Ellis, you could say that Mr. Ellis would have died without the enlarged heart and the methamphetamine. Do you recall that? Those questions?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Sure. Do you recall being asked questions by defense counsel about whether or not Mr. Ellis would have died if he didn't have an enlarged heart and if he didn't have methamphetamine on board? Do you recall that?
Yes.
And can you just explain to the jury what your opinion is with respect to whether or not Mr. Ellis could have died or would have died absent those factors?
Overruled.
Manny Ellis was had a enlarged heart. He had a lot of methamphetamine in his system. But it's the altercation and his position and his and that subdual and restraint that compounds his baseline health, which is a dilated heart and methamphetamine in place. He had that dilated heart and he had that high level of methamphetamine when he comes into contact with others. That altercation is a efficient intervening cause. It is, had he had not come into contact with them and walked home and died because of his heart and his drug, then we would not be implicating the mechanical asphyxia. But the mechanical asphyxia is playing a significant enough part to, and restraint is playing a significant enough part that this is the death at the hands of others, and that makes it a homicide.
Mr. Purchase.
Dr. Mitchell, do you have an opinion as to whether or
I'm
not?
sorry, I thought you concluded your.
Oh, no, I'm sorry, I said I needed to, I was just going to ask.
Okay, go ahead.
Do you have an opinion as to whether or not Mr. Ellis died from a sudden cardiac death?
No, he didn't die from a sudden cardiac death.
And when you watch the videos in this case, did you hear Mr. Ellis on the video indicating he couldn't breathe?
Yes.
Right. That's all I have. Thank you.
Mr. Purchase.
Doctor, just a couple of questions. I think you answered this question when I asked you, when Ms. Eakes asked you the question, the same question, you gave us a longer version. Absent the methamphetamine and the dilated heart, just the altercation, would Mr. Ellis have died?
I don't know.
You don't know. You know, this morning you said he wouldn't. So what's changed from this morning to now?
I don't know if I said that. I don't think I said that.
So you don't know.
Not now. The question is, would he have died just with the altercation?
Correct.
And I've, in pre-trial interviews with them, with you, and with the jury, I've said that we can't pull out that, those factors and suggest that he would have died without them. What I've said just now in my answer is, you have an individual with a dilated heart, with a methamphetamine, that is in an altercation. That altercation is efficient intervening cause to cause death. So I'm not saying that a perfectly healthy individual would have come into contact with law enforcement or died and wouldn't have died, because there's other factors that would have played in that individual's altercation.
You would agree that the ingestion of methamphetamine was self-induced by Mr. Ellis?
Yes.
That the dilated heart from the methamphetamine use was all because of what Mr. Ellis did?
I'm having trouble answering your questions because of the philosophical response that I have inside. So excuse my pause, because I'm trying to answer it in a way that is
Well, let me
not.
ask the question differently. His abuse of methamphetamine for 10+ years caused him to have a dilated
Yes.
heart. And so those two self-imposed problems that he did himself put him in the situation of later having contact with law enforcement.
I don't know.
That's our.
I don't know if that's the case.
The-
That was a poor question, Jay.
Yeah, I agree, it's a poor question, so let's have a different one.
Yeah, let me but let's put it this way. Mr. Ellis, unfortunately, tragically, was a methamphetamine addict, correct?
Yes.
He had a dilated heart because of his methamphetamine addiction.
Yes,
All right, those are two situations that he compromised himself in, correct? For whatever reason, that's what he.
again, I think it's clear that it is his substance use and abuse
Right.
this chronic disease of substance use and abuse he suffered from, yes.
Fair enough. And from the discovery that you saw, it was that chronic use and abuse of substances that put him into contact with law enforcement.
I don't know if it's what put him in contact with law enforcement.
From the initial reports from Officer Burbank and Collins, they described how he presented to you, correct?
Yes,
All right. And that was consistent with a person who was under the influence of methamphetamine,
yes,
okay? And so if indeed that's what occurred, then it was his methamphetamine use, a short period of time before meeting Officer Collins in Burbank, that put him into contact with this teacher.
I'm gonna object, yeah, I think this is lack of foundation and argumentative.
Well, I won't say about the foundation, I'm not sure how, it may be argumentative at this point. Are you trying to get to the idea that somehow Mr. Ellis was a particularly susceptible person because of his medical history and including his,
I'm saying he ingested the methamphetamine shortly before he came upon the police officers.
yeah,
That's how they met.
well, the doctor isn't offered any opinion about how they met. So I think it,
Let me move on to the other side. If we could have exhibits. 255, Doctor, you've got it in front of you as well,
yes,
and you've got that abrasion on the wrist.
yes,
Okay, if in fact, when Mr. Ellis was down on the ground and he had his hands tight together, and the officers are pulling on his hands, that could be a cause of the abrasion.
yes.
And that could be the cause of the abrasion of both his hands.
The brush abrasions on the wrist, the ankle, the wrist, the knuckle,
Yeah,
not the tram track abrasion that is associated with the handcuff,
Right.
but the surrounding abrasions, yes.
those would be from him resisting his arm being pulled away from the hand.
Yes.
anything further, Mr. Burchett?
No, Judge, that's it.
Mr. Esser?
Get a second crack at me.
He asked you about this, and about whether or not you'd expect to see blood associated with the laceration on the knuckle on the left pointer finger. And you hesitated, right?
I don't know if I hesitate. I think before I answer.
Okay, well, when there's a laceration from blunt force trauma, it depends when the laceration occurs relative to bleeding, right?
She asked me whether or not this injury would bleed, and the answer was yes.
Right. But it would only bleed after the laceration occurs, correct?
That's correct.
Right, meaning if Mr. Ellis is punching a window of a patrol car on multiple occasions, you wouldn't expect to see any blood on the patrol car until after the laceration occurs, right?
That's right.
And if the laceration occurs on the second or third punch, it may not deposit on the window, would it?
Again, in order for blood to deposit, blood has to be there. So whenever the laceration would have occurred, it would have had to have occurred before blood is deposited.
Thank you. Can I get, exhibit 24, please? Exhibit 24 was the, paramedics, document that you were reviewing on the big screen. You remember looking at that when Ms. Eaps was asking you questions?
Yes, I have it in front of me.
It was published on our
It
screen.
was on the screen for us, but the jury hasn't seen it because it hasn't been admitted as far as
May I approach, Judge?
you may.
Doctor, on the screen in the on page 1 of Exhibit 24, Do you see that line there that I'm pointing to?
I do.
In fact, what the paramedic said is there was a cardiac arrest secondary to excited delirium, right?
That's what they said.
So the paramedics determined that Mr. Ellis died of cardiac arrest secondary to excited delirium, right?
I don't know if they said it, he died secondary, but it says cardiac arrest secondary to excited delirium.
You testified on redirect when Ms. Each was asking about whether you saw in the videos that you observed in this case, Mr. Ellis hobbled and restrained with pressure on his back. You remember that question?
No, I don't, I'm sorry, that I saw it?
Yeah, let me ask it a better way. Ms. Each asked you if you saw in the video evidence of pressure being applied to Mr. Ellis's back once he was hobbled and restrained. You remember asking that question?
No, I don't remember that.
I didn't ask that question.
Well, he's answered the question, I'll let it stand.
I don't,
The video doesn't show Mr. Ellis being hobbled or restrained at all, right?
no, it doesn't.
And certainly no application of pressure post-hobble and restraint. You agree?
There's no video of the hobble and restraint.
Ms. Eeks asked you about the spit hood on redirect. You remember asking those questions about the spit hood application,
Yes,
including the admonishment or warning within the packaging?
yes.
You don't know when that was applied, do you?
The spit hood?
Yeah.
No, I do not.
You don't know who applied it, right?
That is correct.
You don't know if the person who applied it has even read the warning labels, do you?
I don't.
You don't know if the person who applied it actually was trained with respect to application of that spit hood, do you?
I don't.
And you don't know if any of these three gentlemen were even involved in the application, do you?
I do not.
Finally, at the end of redirect, you went through the things that made this, in your opinion, a homicide,
Yes,
including the contributing factors. I'm not going to go through them all again, but those.
yes,
And that makes it a homicide relative to your duty for classification only, doesn't it?
that is correct.
That doesn't mean there's any criminality associated with that classification, does it?
That is correct.
That's all I have to
Go ahead.
Doctor, covered a couple subjects on redirect. Number one was the medical records. The medical records that you got, the thousands of pages of medical records that go into the details of Mr. Ellis's history, you didn't obtain those until after you had written the report already, right?
That is correct.
Okay, you just had these diagnoses that are noted within the ME reports, but without any specific information.
I believe there was other reports that revealed his past medical history in them, but not to the detail of the thousands of pages of medical record.
Sure. It didn't even say when he was suffering from certain illnesses within the medical record, within the medical examiner's records, right?
That's correct.
Okay. So the pericarditis that Ms. Eeks brought up, it didn't say when he was suffering from pericarditis within the examiner's notes.
Pericarditis, but no, it did not tell me when.
Okay. And within the medical records, I mean, there are a number of instances in which Mr. Ellis is coming in with debilitating chest pain, right?
He definitely has chest pain.
Okay. And he's also coming in on multiple occasions with shortness of breath as well, right?
I believe so.
Okay. And there's also instances where they note hypoxia as well within his medical records.
As I remember it, yes.
Okay. And at some point, actually, within the medical records, there's also an indication that they call a code STEMI, S-T-E-M-I. Do you know what a code STEMI is?
Yes.
Okay.
That's a myocardial infarct. It's a ST elevation myocardial infarct, which is the STEMI. That's if someone has a blockage in one of their coronary arteries, usually in the left, which is the main dominant. You'll see that as a diagnosis. From what I remember, that code was called, but he did not have a myocardial infarct.
Yeah, I was getting there. So it ended up getting called off, but that's a significant event within his history, right?
With someone with chest pain as they present, they may call. That's a common call because that's the worst scenario. You want to make sure that if someone has a blockage in their coronary artery, that you remove that blockage right away on really any type of chest pain.
You'd agree with me that how Mr. Ellis is feeling health-wise leading up to this incident is also important, right?
Yes.
Okay. So in terms of whether he's having shortness of breath leading up into this incident, that'd be an important determination as well, right?
Yes.
And you don't know when the last time it was that he was having shortness of breath prior to this incident.
I do. He earlier that year in 2019, I think was the last time he was seen by any provider, and in those notes, I think it was the fall of 2019, if I'm remembering correctly. In those notes, he's not complaining of any shortness of breath.
While we're looking for that, I'll keep you with it. Sorry, keep that. Trying to close the council with remark is defense exhibit 2022. Can I approach, Your Honor?
Yes.
So I'm showing you what's been marked as defense exhibit 2022.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a Greater Lakes mental health care note, right? Progress note.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually a mental health counseling session, is it not?
I don't know exactly whether it's for a counseling session, but I see it.
Okay.
It says individual therapy.
Okay. And the date of that is November 18th, 2019, right?
Yes.
And the staff on there, it's, the staff's name is Rachel, and the last name is Pasteris, correct?
Yes.
And if you turn to page 2,
Mm-hmm.
Rankine Medical Expert, 005942.
Yes.
And if you look at the bottom of page 2, November 18th, 2019, it says the clinician and manual ended session early. Manuel was feeling ill and displayed labored breathing. Client agreed to have his sister drive him to the nearest urgent care clinic to be seen by a doctor.
Okay.
And even up above there, it says, client left session early per clinician's advice to see a doctor at the nearest urgent care clinic due to chronic medical symptoms displayed during session. You see that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So that's in November of 2019, December, January, February, 3 months, and then we got March 3rd. He's in a mental health session and having breathing issues, right?
It says that he has labored breathing.
Okay. Do you know what position he was in when that was occurring?
I do not. I'm sure sitting up talking to his clinician.
He's not hobbled, right?
No, I don't think he's hobbled in this environment.
Got no weight on his back at all, right?
No, he's not.
But he's having breathing problems.
he doesn't die here either.
Sure, but the question is, why is he having breathing problems, right, doctor?
He has underlying issues with his heart, for sure. That's proven throughout the entire medical record, and we've had conversations that he has this dilated heart. He has these issues, for sure, and
Okay.
it's documented throughout his record.
And those can cause him to have underlying breathing issues,
Yes, as it states.
completely unrelated to any positional asphyxia theory, right?
That is correct.
Okay, just thought we'd agree upon it. And the pre-hospital care report, I can take that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
And the pre-hospital care report, now, I think it was exhibit 24 that was shown to you by the state, from the emergency medical response team, right?
Yes,
Okay. That pre-hospital care report, there are also interviews with those paramedics as well, correct?
I believe so.
Okay. And in those interviews, those paramedics go into greater detail about what they're actually seeing and what's actually detailed within that report, right?
I believe so.
Okay. So the pre-hospital care report is essentially they're scribing what's transpiring, but their visual observations may be something different, right?
This report in forensic medicine, this report is the time accurate for exactly what's happening at the time in which they're attending to the patient. So that's how I see this particular record.
Okay, but you're not discounting what the paramedics may be also telling investigators during interviews regarding their observations, right?
No, I'm not discounting. I'm just talking about why and how I relied on this report.
Okay. And did you know, so that pre-hospital care report, it's associated with a Life Pack 15. You know what the Life Pack 15 is?
I don't.
All right, it's a defibrillator that
Okay.
they use.
Okay, that
And
makes sense.
That defibrillator picks up certain data regarding the patient that's being treated. You aware of that?
I believe so.
And did you know that the Life Pack 15 picked up the data with regard to the treatment of Mr. Ellis on the day in question?
No.
So that information was never provided to you by the Attorney General's office?
It may be in the materials that I have, and I don't remember it or did not review it.
Just in follow up on that, right? So the Life Pack 15, the EKG machine that's strapped to Mr. Ellis, that may pick up what his rhythm is at the time, right?
Yes, it may.
But we don't know what Mr. Ellis's heart is doing from the time that he is leaving his house that evening to the time that he comes in contact with paramedics later that evening, right?
No, I don't know what his heart is doing.
What his initial cardiac rhythm is.
No, I don't know what his initial cardiac rhythm is.
Okay. I don't have any further questions. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.
Ms. Eakes, anything further?
No, Your Honor.
Okay. Thank you, Doctor, very much.
Thank you.
can be excused.
I appreciate it.
Have a safe trip home.
Thank you so much.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll see you guys tomorrow, same time. Please do not discuss the case among yourselves with anyone else, and do not permit anyone to discuss the case with you or in your presence. Thank you.